So prepare to lead some incursions and foment revolt against the Imperium. Today we're taking a look at the enigmatic Alpha Legion in Warhammer 40K. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Chaos once more, and in this video I thought we'd take a focused look at the shadowy Alpha Legion and what they can bring to the table in 40k. We'll talk about their current in-game power, go over their Legion rules, some of the strongest options that they can bring to the board, and finish up with one solid army list. In the lore, the 20th Legion are a pretty distinctive force of Chaos Space Marines. They're clad in metallic blue-green armour, and basically make war in a spec ops way for chaos, fomenting uprisings with an unclear and mysterious agenda, sometimes disguising their warriors as those of other legions, and whenever you kill one it turns out that they weren't the one in charge after all, it was some other bloke over there. In game, in the current Chaos Codex, I would rank them as one of the slightly weaker Chaos Space Marines currently. At tournaments, people generally tend to flock to the strongest stuff, and the Alpha Legion have a very small representation indeed, only making up 4% of Chaos Marine armies. Their current win percentage doesn't seem to be too bad, hovering at around about 48%, does imply that they have some nasty tricks, and you can have success with a strong list of them. They certainly do have some fun and powerful options. I feel like they might be a little bit more niche because they have a bit more range synergy than a fair few of the other traitor legions, and in general a lot of the stronger units in Codex Chaos Space Marines tend to be more combat ones. They do seem like a pretty interesting legion to play though, definitely a different sort of flavour of chaos, and they do have some very nasty tricks that they can spring on people. If we take a look at their rules then, their core legion trait is Masters of Duplicity. This one basically keeps them a bit safer at long range. If they're greater than 12 inches away then they get -1 to hit, which does get a bit worse to greater than 18 inches for things with 10 wounds or more. A pretty nice debuff that one, it'll certainly save them from a little bit of ranged firepower. It's particularly brutal on any shooting from lower ballistic skill armies such as say Guard, Orcs or maybe even Tau, but it is perhaps a little bit matchup specific. Things that have very high ballistic skill like Custodies won't care too much, and of course nor will anything that mainly wants to just kill you in melee. If you are playing against a pure combat army, then this bit isn't really going to help you at all. The other bit is a bit of flexibility on falling back. You can do an action after fall back, and also fall back and charge if you need to. The actions bit is okay, could give you a few more options for doing things like raising banners and stuff, and falling back and charging is pretty useful to be honest, particularly on maybe big durable things like Terminators that might well get into combat and then still survive a turn locked up. While they're both nice to have though, I do feel that they're very niche and maybe not something to build the whole strategy around. The Alpha Legion do have a secondary objective called Infiltrate and Subvert. It's a shadow operations one, and unfortunately it seems to be one of the very weakest ones available to Chaos. It's not taken very much and it doesn't score the average player very much. What you need to do is do actions within 6 inches of your opponent's deployment zone for 3 victory points, or wholly within it for 4 VP. You have to do it with a non-character infantry squad. You do it at the end of the movement phase, but it only completes at the end of your command phase, so basically your opponent gets to have the chance to just blow up your unit that was standing around doing the objective. If you did manage to complete the action within range of an objective, you do get a fun chance to subvert it and basically stop the enemy controlling it for the rest of the game, which is kind of big. I guess theoretically if you did manage to get some forces round the back of the enemy army, kill their objective holders and do the action, then that could be a really meaningful thing. But even if you do that, then it's not even guaranteed to happen, it only goes off on a 3+, and it is kind of dependent on taking the opponent's stronghold from them, which seems a little bit optimistic. Overall, I'd just probably not go for this one in favour of things like banners and retrieved data. Next up, and far more positive, are the Alpha Legion stratagems. A lot of these are really quite fun, and one quite nice one is Conceal, 2 or 3 CP, and you use it at the start of your shooting phase. One unit can't be shot unless it's less than 12 inches from the enemy or the closest viable target. Very nice to protect anything if it's absolutely vital. I guess in theory you could stop some objective holders or something getting shot with this, but at least on paper it looks like it could be most valuable on something like Havocs or Obliterators, fairly valuable shooting units that you want to have shooting, but you don't want to get shot back if you can avoid it. For 2 CP there's a Deadly Ambush. The enemy comes in from reserve, and until the end of your next turn you get a +1 to hit this unit. I guess if it is a really massive enemy unit that you think you're going to be dumping your entire army's firepower into, then the +1 to hit army-wide really isn't bad. If it's just something small though that's killable by a couple of units, it's probably not worth the 2 CP. For 1 CP there's Coils of Deception. That one's fall back and shoot for a core unit, and it's quite nice to have the reliability to know that your unit isn't going to get locked up. Really quite a nice one to have on standby, and means that your opponent can't just tag, say, a powerful shooting unit to keep it out of the fight. I'd say it's most likely to be most helpful on things like Terminators perhaps, who can also fall back and charge with the Masters of Duplicity trait. Getting a whole ton of combo alter fire for 1 CP seems good, or maybe shooting units like Havocs. Quite nice to have this as an option, as it means they won't get locked up and you can guarantee their firepower. For 1 CP, perhaps the single most important stratagem out of any of these I think is Forward Operatives. This one grants an infantry unit a pre-game move. It moves normally anywhere that's greater than 9 inches from enemy units, and you can use it twice in 2000 point games. If you happen to be going first, they should pretty much guarantee you automatic charges with things like Warp Talons, who should be right in the opponent's deployment zone turn 1 if you want them to be, and to be pretty powerful for units like Possessed as well, again with a big 9-inch move, or Terminators who are slow and mighty but want to get up the board as fast as possible. A really good one this one, and maybe one of the biggest draws to playing Alpha Legion. For 1 CP there's Renascent Infiltration, an infantry unit greater than 6 inches from the enemy returns to Strategic Reserve instead of moving. Potentially that can be interesting towards the end of the game if there's a slow unit that's completely out of position. You might be able to spring up turn 5 somewhere behind the enemy, maybe do certain actions like retrieving data or getting line of sight on key objective holders and try and take them out. For 1 to 3 CP there's a really fun one in Sabotaged Armory. When you destroy an enemy vehicle, they automatically trigger their Explodes rule, potentially showering a good chunk of the enemy army and a bunch of mortal wounds. It's 1 CP for a small vehicle, 2 CP if they're up to 19 wounds, or 3 CP if they're something massive like a knight or something. If you do manage to use some heavy weapons to take down a big tank, then this could genuinely be an absolutely great way to get some scattered mortal wounds. For tanks and vehicles with a big decent sized hull and a 6-inch aura of D3 mortal wounds on each unit, you could easily be getting something like 10 mortal wounds on the enemy, which could easily be worth the 2 CP. The existence of this one maybe just makes it a little bit more tempting to try and gun down a big enemy tank or something while it's in the middle of an enemy formation. For 2 CP there's Scrambled Coordinates. At the start of the enemy reinforcement phase, the enemy can't set up within 12 inches of 2 nominated core units. A lot of the time I think that's going to be a little bit underwhelming, but maybe if you're playing against an army like Genestealer cults or something, who really relies coming in close to the enemy and attacking them, then this could be well worth saving a couple of CP for, and really mess with their plans on a couple of units on forward objectives. Finally, for 1 CP there's Veiled Agenda. You get to conceal one of your secondary objectives until the first time that you score points for it. I'm honestly a little bit unconvinced as to how much value this one really adds. You'd expect to score some points for most of them in the first turn or two, and then the advantage will be lost. I could imagine this one just being greeted by a bit of a shrug from the opponent. In any case, some really usable ones there, potentially Forward Operatives being the single most standout. Moving on to character upgrades next, and for Warlord traits we have the very fluffy I Am Alfarius. For this model you get to randomly determine a Warlord trait, and then if this model is destroyed, you get to select another character to be a Warlord and then choose a Warlord trait for them. This new Warlord counts as the real one for the purposes of objectives and things. It's not awful, but the randomness is a bit of a turn-off. You could get something useful, or be stuck with one of your key characters having basically nothing all game long, and you only ever get any extra value out of it if he dies, which isn't even guaranteed and probably a net loss for you anyway. I think it's maybe not the worst idea on the world on a model that you think you're going to be charging up to its death. Perhaps a Demon Prince with Golax, or a Master of Executions maybe. You might land something useful like one of the combat buffs, but I do feel that in general you're probably just best off with picking a Warlord trait that you want for the rest of the game. Next up there's Clandestine. Unmodified hit rolls of 1 to 3 fail, and you get +1 to your saves in cover. This one's a pretty reasonable defensive boost to be honest. If you're stacking with Armour of Contempt, maybe with Terminator armour or something, then you would have a spectacularly hard to kill character at range. The cover thing isn't going to apply very much in combat though. Headhunter is a shooting one, where rapid fire or pistol weapons get to ignore Lookout Sir. You get to reroll wound rolls, and 6s to wound cause 1 mortal wound as well. It's really quite a nasty shooting buff, but maybe slightly limited by the choice of combi weapons and things that you can take. Should probably allow you to average about 1 mortal wound per turn, plus maybe a save or 2. Perhaps it would be a bit more useful if there was a really meaningful shooting weapon to stack it with. I guess maybe the best that you can hope for on that front might be a combo of this and the Warp's Malice pistol, with its chance for mortal wounds. Next up we've got Master of Diversion. 3 Alpha Legion units in your deployment zone get to redeploy somewhere else nearby, or go into Strategic Reserve. This one's pretty excellent to be honest. It means that if you had a unit that was out of position, say it was the enemy that was getting first turn and they were just about to shoot it, or say you had first turn and they weren't in a very threatening place to do much useful, then you'd basically get to flip things around and have the best of both worlds. From my reading, it'd still be able to be combined very well with forward operatives as well. Seems like it'd be pretty powerful to redeploy a unit and then pre-game move them. You could reliably threaten just about any part of the opponent's deployment zone. I feel like this one might be the single strongest of the bunch. Otherwise, we've got Cult Leader. One cultist unit within 9 inches gets +1 to hit and an extra AP -1 better at range and melee. This one's a very nice boost to accursed cultists. Their combat damage actually isn't too bad already, and they both hit badly and have kind of mediocre AP, so getting both of those amped up is great. Probably one that I'd run if I was running a big unit of accursed cultists, but not bother with if I wasn't. Finally, there's Covert Control. One core unit within 6 inches can shoot while doing an action, and also gains objective secured. I'd say this is just all around great for Terminators. Chaos Terminators can be made crazily tanky these days. Giving objective secured is very handy indeed, and the shoot and action thing isn't at all bad either. They could be stomping up the board, raising banners and things, and not compromising on putting out a whole load of combi bolter fire. Another good one there, the objective secured alone makes it tempting. Lastly, for the character upgrades, we have the Relics, which I feel are maybe a little bit less overwhelming. The Blade of the Hydra gives you a strength +1, AP -2, damage 1 chainsword, and it gets you an extra D3 +3 attacks, or 6 if there's more than 6 enemies within 3 inches. A pretty excellent anti-horde combat weapon there. Probably doesn't really outshine things like demon weapons though. The Drake Scale Plate is an infantry model getting a 2+ save and unmodified wound rolls of 1 to 3 auto fail. Potentially can make one model a fair bit more tanky, particularly maybe with that clandestine trait getting the +1 to save in cover. Hydra's Whale is an ability to make one stratagem for the enemy cost a bit more. After they've used it once, then any subsequent uses of it will cost you an additional CP, so pretty nice to have on something that you think the opponent might use all game long, maybe something like Space Marine Transhuman Physiology. I feel this one's a bit take or leave. It could give your opponent a headache. I think in some games it'll genuinely just be a small CP sink for you, and the opponent might not care too much. The Viper's Bite is an 18-inch pistol 6 bolt pistol, strength 4, AP 3 and damage 1. I guess again that could be one that you could combine with Headhunter if you wanted those wound rerolls. Otherwise, despite a high volume of fire, that strength 4 just seems a little bit limited. Hydra's Teeth is another bolt weapon upgrade. You fire a single shot with it, which automatically hits. You get +2 strength, +2 damage, and AP -2 better, and ignore imballs. I guess it basically amounts to a single attack with usually strength 6, AP 2, and damage 3. Not too bad for having a punch against some elite infantry, but still feels a bit more of a fun upgrade than one that really is going to be guaranteed to do a load of damage for the CP cost. The Icon of the Hydra Cult is a cultist buffing one. Cultists within 6 inches get dense cover, and you could take that with the Dark Covenant if you wanted. I guess again, in theory, if you really want to be spamming out the accursed cultists, then that's very nice for them as well. If you wanted to try and make them work, then getting dense cover on them, plus the extra melee boost on one unit, seems pretty reasonable for a buffing character of some sort. Finally, we've got the Mind Veil. An infantry model gets an extra D6-inch movement and gets to move through models and terrain. A bit faster, but maybe a little bit unreliably so. I feel like this one is kind of interesting. Now standard characters can't take jump packs and things, this at least makes them a bit faster. To bring things together a bit then, here are just maybe a few ideas for what I think might be some of the strongest options in the Alpha Legion army. Between their Legion traits and stratagems, in general they tend to have quite a lot of buffs for ranged infantry. Infantry unit likes the -1 to hit thing, a fair few of their stratagems work for them, and ranged units are likely to be further away and could have options like falling back and shooting or using conceal. Particularly Havocs can make use of all that, Obliterators and Vehicles can make use of some of the bits. As with just about every Chaos Space Marine Legion, Terminators seem to be pretty excellent in Alpha Legion as well. They'll love a pre-game move to make their big durability and scary profile just a little bit more threatening. -1 to hit will make them even more durable as they stomp up the board. Options for falling back and shooting and falling back and charging are maybe more relevant on them than most, and also objective secured on that Warlord Trait does seem pretty nice for them too. Just going with that pre-game move though, certainly faster things like Possessed or Warp Talons will very much like that as well. Certainly have very decent chances for first turn charges. Warp Talons with their good movement might be near enough guaranteed if you do want to go all in on cutting up the enemy straight away. Cultists and Accursed Cultists both seem like they've got a little bit more support than most here as well, particularly the Accursed Cultists with that big damage buff in combat. Finally, obviously anything that's just generically strong for Chaos will be fine. Abaddon the Despoiler, buffing units like the Master of Possession, the Master of Executions, and the Lord Discordant. Maybe they don't gain enormous amounts more for being Alpha Legion, but they're strong enough normally. For Relics and Warlord Traits, I feel like the Alpha Legion ones definitely have stiff competition from the standard Codex ones. Things like Flames of Spite on a big fighty character, or Golax, the great big Nurgalax for a Demon Prince. Both of those are great. And I feel like maybe the biggest competition options they have are Master of Diversion, the Warlord trait for redeployment, and Covert Control, the Warlord trait for objective secured. I'd say the Relics are maybe a little bit more lackluster. The Drake Scale Plate is a pretty decent survivability boost to an infantry model, and you could combine it with Clandestine for being hard to shift in cover. And the Mind Veil could be a nice fast one that you could use to make an infantry character go a bit quicker. In a lot of Chaos lists though, it does seem that if you want a big tanky and fighty Chaos unit, you might just be better off going with one of the bigger threats that isn't infantry, either a Demon Prince or a Lord Discordant. Finally, out of their stratagems, I feel like their fallback and shoot will be pretty handy on occasion. Conceal could be nice to protect a unit that's not closest. Forward Operatives is probably the single most interesting for guaranteed extra movement early on. And I do quite like that Sabotaged Armory one. If you do manage to use your ranged guns to blow up a vehicle in a key position, then that could be absolutely brutal. Finally, as I mentioned, Alpha Legions really haven't been played all that much at tournaments over in the Nephilim season. There aren't a whole ton of examples of top lists for them, but here was just one example that seems to have done quite well. A list that I found that went 4-1 at the massive London Grand Tournament. It was run by a chap called Ryan Kerr, and getting this sort of win to loss record is really not bad at a massive event of over 600 people. The list is organised into a single battalion and Supreme Command detachment, and it's maybe a little bit more divergent than a fair few of the other Chaos lists that I've seen. Quite cool to see some interesting choices being run. Characters wise, we've got Abaddon the Despoiler because he's almost auto-included for Chaos at the moment with his stats. Doesn't really need too much explanation. Ridiculous melee power, and lightly giving himself 4 rerolls to hit and wound as well. Otherwise, perhaps the most interesting character from an Alpha Legion perspective is the Dark Apostle. He takes Zinch to ignore a failed saving throw, and has the Omen of Potency to make his combat better. He's just massively stacked with pre-game stratagems. He takes the Drake Scale Plate, the Black Mace, and Clandestine, and that means that 1s to 3s to hit and wound will both fail against him, and he gets a 2+ save with Armour of Contempt, and an extra +1 to that if he gets cover. The Black Mace is a generally scary damage 3 power maul, and has the fun ability that lost wounds spill over to the next model, and Omen of Potency puts him into rage mode, getting an extra 3 attacks with that very scary weapon. Kind of interesting to see one of those set up as a smash character. People often just tend to use them for illusory supplication for buffing, but he looks like he's really quite tanky and scary. Otherwise, we've got a Master of Possession, who looks like he'd be supporting the Obliterators, maybe resurrecting them when they die. He also takes Possession as well, which is the one that can snipe infantry. Not 100% sure why that's not Warp Marks or one of the others, to be honest. I feel like he's got so many other better spells to choose from. Then there's a Master of Executions with Nurgle Mark and Golax, a very scary hidden combat character with automatic wounds. And then we get into the various squads. 1 unit of 5 Legionaries with Bolters, 2 units of 10 Cultists with firearms, all should do good work on objectives, a big unit of Possessed with the Black Rune. Kind of fun to see it being used on something other than Terminators, to be honest. If I've counted right, then there will be just 1 CP that will be available to make them pre-game move and push them up the board somewhere scary if it was wanted. Then there's 2 units of Rubric Marines with Warp Flamers. They're very efficient anti-infantry damage dealers with Let the Galaxy Burn, getting an average of 5 or 6 auto hits with Strength 4 AP 2 each, and Warp Time will give them the movement to get them in range, I guess. Then there's 3 Obliterators, a nice ranged unit for an Alpha Legion army, will be quite hard to shift from cover. And finally rounding up, we've got 2 Vindicators with Siege Shields, big tough tanks now with a more reliable output of shooting with D3+3 and AP-4 as well. Seem like pretty good distraction units, things that the opponent can't really afford to ignore but are quite tough to take down. Overall, it really is quite a cool Chaos list, a bit different to the normal, fairly generic build that you see for Chaos Space Marines these days, and it's quite nice to see a bit more creativity. Definitely has some strong stuff, and it's quite nice to see a Chaos Space Marine list building into a bit more of a ranged theme than just a melee one. I've got no doubt that it was played well if it reached such a high placing at such a massive and competitive event. So I think we'll leave that there for the Alpha Legion anyway. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below, or any other sneaky tricks or duplicitous tactics that you might have going yourself for the 20th Legion. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, or I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I have made a video like this for just about every single one of the other Legions now, and I'll try and finish up the last few over the next few weeks. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page, and you can find that down in the video description below. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.